On March 17, 1776, British forces evacuated Boston. The American Revolution was underway. A new nation was being born, one founded on principles that would change human history. All men are created equal, unalienable rights, government by consent of the governed. The monarch those revolutionaries were fighting against was King George III. His wife, the Queen of England during the birth of the United States of America, was a woman named Charlotte. You've probably seen her name. Charlotte, North Carolina, Charlottesville, Virginia. Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, Queens County in New York, renamed after her. Cities across the former colonies, named to honor the British Queen during the most consequential period in American history. But there's something about Queen Charlotte that neither the British establishment nor American history books have ever wanted to discuss openly. Something documented in royal archives, confirmed by eyewitness accounts, visible in portraits that still hang in museums today. Queen Charlotte, the woman whose bloodline runs through every British monarch since 1761, including King Charles III, had African ancestry. And the evidence has been hiding in plain sight for 263 years. I want to be clear about something from the start. This is not internet speculation. This is not revisionist history. This is not a modern political agenda projected backward onto historical figures. This is what people who knew Queen Charlotte personally wrote down during her lifetime. Sir Walter Scott, the most celebrated novelist of the 19th century, a man knighted by Charlotte's own son, described her with 3 specific words: a true mulatto face. In the language of the 18th and 19th centuries, that term had one meaning. It described a person of mixed African and European ancestry. There was no ambiguity, no alternative interpretation. Baron Stockmar, personal physician to the royal family for decades, a man who examined the Queen countless times, wrote in his private journals that Charlotte possessed a true mulatto face. The same exact phrase, 2 different witnesses, exposed to the Queen in entirely different contexts, using identical racially specific language. Queen Victoria's own physician, examining Charlotte's descendants, noted what he called Negro physiognomy in the royal bloodline. These weren't hostile witnesses. They weren't political enemies trying to embarrass the crown. They were loyalists, insiders, men with careers that depended on royal favor. They wrote what they observed because they had no reason to lie. The ancestry question isn't speculation either. Queen Charlotte's family tree has been documented for centuries. The records exist. Genealogists have traced them, and what they reveal is straightforward. Charlotte descended from a 15th century Portuguese noblewoman named Margarita de Castro e Sousa, a direct descendant of King Afonso III of Portugal. Here's where history becomes complicated in ways most people never learn. For over 700 years, the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain and Portugal, was partially ruled by the Moors. These were North African Muslims who crossed the Strait of Gibraltar in 711 AD and established sophisticated civilizations that lasted until 1492. During those 7 centuries, intermarriage between Moorish nobility and Portuguese royalty was commonplace. Political alliances were sealed through marriage. Noble bloodlines merged. The genetic legacy of North Africa wove itself permanently into Iberian aristocracy. King Afonso III's mistress, a woman named Madragana, was, according to multiple historians, of Moorish descent. Their children were integrated into the Portuguese royal house. That bloodline passed through 9 generations of European nobility until it reached a small German duchy called Mecklenburg-Strelitz. In 1744, a baby girl was born there. Her name was Sophia Charlotte. 17 years later, she would become Queen of England. But here's what makes this story remarkable. We don't have to rely solely on genealogical records or written accounts. We have the portraits. In 1761, immediately after Charlotte became queen, the Scottish painter Alan Ramsay was commissioned to paint her official portrait. Ramsay was known for his accuracy. His portraits were praised for capturing subjects exactly as they appeared, without flattery or embellishment. That portrait still exists. You can view it today. Look at it carefully. The nose is notably broad. The lips are full. The complexion is darker than any other European royal portrait of that era. The bone structure of the face is distinctive. Now compare that portrait to paintings made of Charlotte 20 and 30 years later. The transformation is striking. The nose has narrowed. The lips have thinned. The skin has lightened considerably. The overall appearance has shifted toward conventional European features. Same woman, same throne. Dramatically different faces. This wasn't the natural variation you might see between different artists. This was systematic, deliberate, a gradual painted erasure of whatever it was that Ramsay captured in 1761. Ask yourself, why would the British establishment commission portraits that progressively made their queen look less like herself? Unless they were trying to make her look less like something else. To understand why this matters, you have to understand 1761. Britain wasn't just a European monarchy. It was the operational center of the transatlantic slave trade. British ships transported more enslaved Africans than any other nation on earth. Liverpool and Bristol had become two of the wealthiest cities in the world, built entirely on human trafficking. British merchants bought and sold human beings as routinely as they traded cloth or tea. The economic structure of the British Empire depended on a specific belief that African people were fundamentally different from Europeans. Less than human, property rather than persons. This wasn't just casual prejudice. It was organized, institutional ideology. British scientists published books arguing that Africans constituted a separate, inferior species. British philosophers wrote treatises claiming black people lacked the capacity for reason or morality. British clergymen debated whether Africans possessed souls at all. This intellectual infrastructure existed for one reason: to justify the unjustifiable, to provide moral cover for an economic system built on kidnapping, torture, and murder. And in the middle of this, at the exact historical moment when Britain most needed to believe in white European superiority, the King of England married a woman with African ancestry. Consider the impossibility of that situation. How do you maintain an ideology of racial hierarchy when your own queen doesn't fit the hierarchy? How do you publish scientific treatises about African inferiority when your monarch's children carry African blood? How do you justify enslaving people based on their ancestry when that same ancestry runs through the royal family? You can't, so you do the only thing possible. You make it disappear. The erasure of Queen Charlotte's ancestry was never announced. There was no decree, no official policy, no written directive. It simply happened. Portrait commissions began producing images of a progressively more European-looking queen. References to her Portuguese ancestry, once a matter of genealogical record, quietly vanished from court discussions. Anyone who remarked on her unusual appearance was dismissed as ill-mannered. By the time Charlotte died in 1818, the transformation was complete. The woman in the later portraits bore little resemblance to the woman Ramsay had painted 57 years earlier. And for the next 2 centuries, that's where the story stayed. Buried, forgotten, occasionally mentioned by researchers who were promptly ignored. In 1940, a black American historian named J.A. Rogers published documentation of Charlotte's ancestry in his book, Sex and Race. He traced the genealogy. He cited the contemporary accounts. He analyzed the portrait evidence. The academic establishment dismissed him entirely. A black man making claims about the British royal family. Obviously agenda-driven, obviously unreliable. In 1999, PBS Frontline aired a documentary investigating Charlotte's ancestry. Professional genealogists confirmed the Portuguese connection. Historians acknowledged the Moorish bloodlines in that lineage. The British royal family declined to comment. Mainstream historians shrugged and moved on. The story returned to its burial place. But this isn't just British history, it's American history too. When Charlotte became queen in 1761, the American colonies were still British possessions. The cities named after her, Charlotte, Charlottesville, and others, were named to honor the reigning queen of what colonists still considered their mother country. Charlotte, North Carolina, today one of America's largest cities, a financial center second only to New York, was named after a queen who, according to multiple contemporary witnesses, had a true mulatto face. Think about what that means. When the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, the queen those founders were repudiating was a woman of African descent. When George Washington was fighting British forces, the consort to King George III was a woman whose ancestry connected to North Africa. When the Constitution was being drafted, including its notorious 3/5 compromise that counted enslaved people as partial persons for representation purposes, The royal family the founders had rejected included African bloodlines. The American Revolution was, in part, a revolt against a monarchy that was itself of mixed racial heritage. Neither the British nor the Americans have ever wanted to acknowledge this. Charlotte and George III had 15 children together. 15. Those children married into royal houses across Europe. Their children had children. Those children had more children. The genetic legacy of Queen Charlotte didn't stay confined to Britain. It spread throughout European aristocracy like ink through water. By the 20th century, Charlotte's descendants occupied thrones across the continent. Her bloodline had merged with virtually every significant royal house in Europe. And in Britain, the succession was unbroken. George IV, Charlotte's son; William IV, Charlotte's son; Queen Victoria, Charlotte's granddaughter; Edward VII, George V, Edward V, George VI, all descended from Charlotte. Elizabeth II, who reigned for 70 years and died in 2022, Charlotte's direct descendant. Charles III, the current king, Charlotte's direct descendant. William, Prince of Wales, Charlotte's direct descendant. Every British monarch for the past 263 years has carried whatever genetic heritage Charlotte brought to the throne. If Charlotte had African ancestry, as the eyewitnesses said, as the genealogical records show, as the early portraits suggest, then so does every British royal alive today. In 2018, Prince Harry married Meghan Markle, a biracial American actress. The British tabloid coverage was vicious. Barely coded racist language appeared in headline after headline. Meghan was described as exotic. Her family was scrutinized for any hint of impropriety. Her very presence in the royal family was treated as contamination. Some members of the royal family itself, we now know, expressed concern about how dark her children might be. The message was unmistakable. Meghan Markle was bringing something foreign into the British monarchy, something that didn't belong, something black. But here's what makes that reaction not just cruel, but historically absurd. Meghan Markle wasn't introducing African ancestry to the British royal family. It was already there. It had been there for 263 years. Prince Harry himself, through his descent from Queen Charlotte, already carried whatever African heritage the family has spent centuries trying to erase. The racist backlash against Meghan was based on a fiction. The fiction that the House of Windsor was ever purely white European. The fiction that African heritage was new to the British throne. It wasn't new, it was foundational. The royal family had simply convinced themselves and the world otherwise. We live in an era of extraordinary scientific capability. DNA testing can now trace ancestry with remarkable precision. We can identify genetic markers that reveal heritage going back dozens of generations. The technology exists to answer the Charlotte question definitively. Queen Charlotte's remains are entombed at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. Testing those remains would settle the debate permanently. The royal family has declined to authorize such testing. Ask yourself why. If the ancestry claims were false, if Charlotte were purely European with no African heritage whatsoever, genetic testing would prove it. The rumors would be put to rest forever. The royal family could point to scientific evidence and close the book on this chapter. They haven't done that. They've maintained official silence while refusing the one test that could resolve the question. Perhaps they don't know what the results would show. Or perhaps they know exactly what the results would show. And that's precisely why the testing hasn't happened. Here's a question historians have debated. Did Charlotte herself know? She almost certainly did. Charlotte would have known her own family history. The Portuguese ancestry wasn't secret. It was recorded in genealogical documents. She would have understood where her mother's bloodline originated. And her behavior suggests awareness. Charlotte was unusually sympathetic to black individuals, strikingly so for a European queen of her era. She personally supported Olaudah Equiano, a formerly enslaved African whose autobiography became one of the most powerful abolitionist documents ever published. Consider what that means. The Queen of England, whose husband's government was actively profiting from the slave trade, supporting a black man's efforts to end it. Charlotte collected African art and botanical specimens at a time when such objects were dismissed as primitive curiosities. She established Kew Gardens, preserving plant species from across Africa and the colonial world. And there are accounts, recorded in letters and journals of the era, of Charlotte facing mockery from British aristocrats, nobles making cruel observations about her appearance, jokes whose meaning she would have understood perfectly. Charlotte lived her entire adult life carrying knowledge that the empire around her was desperately trying to suppress. She was at minimum of mixed African and European ancestry, and she sat on the throne of a nation that was enslaving people who looked like her ancestors. Imagine carrying that contradiction for 57 years. Queen Charlotte's story illuminates something that the architects of colonialism and slavery never wanted understood. Race as a biological category determining human worth was always a fiction. Charlotte was considered European enough to marry a king. Her children were European enough to inherit thrones. Her descendants were European enough to rule the largest empire in human history. But she carried the same African ancestry that was used to justify enslaving millions of human beings. The difference between royalty and property wasn't genetic, it was political. It was about which stories got told and which got erased. About who controlled the narrative and who was silenced. About power, not biology. The elaborate intellectual infrastructure of racial hierarchy, the scientific racism, the philosophical justifications, the religious arguments, was never about truth. It was about money. It was about justifying a system that made certain people extraordinarily wealthy by treating other people as merchandise. Charlotte's very existence disproved the ideology her empire enforced. She was living evidence that the racial categories were arbitrary, that the hierarchies were constructed, that the science was fiction. That's why they erased her. Not because her ancestry was shameful, because her ancestry was inconvenient. For those of us who grew up in American schools during the 1960s and 1970s, history was presented as a simple story. There was European history, white history, which was presented as the main narrative. The rise of civilization, the march of progress, kings and queens and founding fathers. And there was black history, presented as a separate category, a footnote, something to be acknowledged during a designated month, then set aside. What Charlotte's story reveals is that this separation was always false. African heritage isn't a separate stream running alongside European history. It's woven through it, present in the bloodlines, embedded in the genetic code, there even where it was most violently erased. The royal family that presided over colonizing Africa had African ancestry. The monarchy that benefited from the slave trade carried blood from the very continent it was exploiting. The empire that built its wealth on white supremacy was never actually purely white. This isn't an exception to history, it is history. The real history that the textbooks left out. King Charles III was crowned in May 2023. He descends directly from Queen Charlotte. Her blood runs in his veins, diluted by generations but present nonetheless. If the genealogical records are accurate, if the eyewitness accounts are truthful, if the early portraits show what they appear to show, then King Charles III has African ancestry. So does Prince William, heir to the throne. So did Queen Elizabeth II, who reigned for 7 decades. So has every British monarch since 1761. The royal family has maintained official silence on this question. They neither confirm nor deny. They simply don't discuss it. But silence isn't refutation. The evidence exists. The records are there, the portraits remain, and the DNA, locked in remains at Windsor Castle, could answer the question forever. If anyone ever has the courage to test it. Here's what I want to leave you with. This isn't just a story about one queen. It's a story about how history gets written, about who gets to tell it, about what happens to truths that powerful people find inconvenient. For 263 years, the British establishment has successfully suppressed the African heritage of its own royal family. They painted over portraits. They ignored genealogical evidence. They dismissed researchers. They maintained official silence. And they nearly succeeded in erasing Queen Charlotte entirely. But not quite. The early portraits survived. Allan Ramsay's 1761 painting still hangs in a museum, showing exactly what he saw. Sir Walter Scott's words are still in print. A true mulatto face. The genealogical records connecting Charlotte to Portuguese nobility remain documented in archives across Europe. The truth survived because truth tends to survive. You can paint over portraits. You can rewrite textbooks. You can train historians to look the other way. But you can't change what people saw with their own eyes. And you can't rewrite genetics. Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, Queen Consort of Great Britain and Ireland, from 1761 to 1818. Grandmother to Queen Victoria, ancestor to every British monarch since her death, her blood flows through King Charles III. And according to the people who knew her, according to the portraits they couldn't quite erase, according to the genealogical records that trace back 9 generations to medieval Portugal, she was black. Or at the very least, she was of mixed African and European ancestry, and that heritage never left the British throne. It's still there today. They just keep pretending it isn't. The cities named after her, Charlotte, North Carolina, Charlottesville, Virginia, still bear her name. The descendants who carry her blood still rule England. The truth that powerful people spent centuries trying to bury is still there waiting to be acknowledged. 263 years. That's how long this secret has been hidden in plain sight. Now you know it too. What you do with that knowledge is up to you.